let's move the Supreme Court of Canada to Winnipeg. Yes, I said Winnipeg. I'll get back to why and maybe even when. But first, let me take you back to 1995. In 1995, we not only almost lost Quebec, we nearly lost the country in total. What do I mean? Well, if Quebec had seceded as a wholesale matter or in part, we not only would have had no territorial continuity from east to west across the country, and not only will we have allowed the biggest part of Confederation to have been excised from the heart of the country, but most importantly, it would have been almost impossible for Ottawa to reimpose its legitimacy across this continent-sized giant country, from St. John's to Victoria, up to Yellowknife, Iqaluit, and Whitehorse. Impossible for a new Prime Minister and a new cabinet to say, let's go back to the way it was ex ante. Because remember, Canada today is much larger, much more complex than the simple 4 colonies that confederated in 1867. So Canada would have been gone, and it would have dissolved maybe into its constituent parts, maybe with some violence, perhaps not, but it would have been very, very messy, and the disintegration could have happened very fast. If you find that skeptical, if you're skeptical about that, because we're of course Canadians and tomorrow is in the public sense largely like today and like yesterday, it's been a peaceable kingdom by and large for over 150 years, one need only look at the recent history of the Soviet Union. 15 republics, huge, larger than Canada, granted, very complex borders, but thought to be indestructible by its citizens until the 11th hour, at which point it disintegrated with great rapidity into its constituent parts, and it was very messy and continues to be very messy. But if you had asked Soviet citizens in the early 1980s, even mid-1980s, whether they fancied that the Soviet Union would fall apart in a few years' time, they would have said, impossible. And of course, we think the same in Canada today. So the Quebec question remains alive. But the most acute question today, and this is perhaps a shock or a surprise to central Canada or Atlantic Canada, is the question of the West. The West is in a state of not only angst, but pique. I have colleagues, friends, and I myself can report that there is great unrest there. There is great discomfort about the state of the Federation from the Western provinces, from the Western population. It's not just a populist backlash. It is a question of distance from decision-making centers, distance from the capital in Ottawa, distance from the economic heart of the country in Toronto and the intellectual Laurentian axis. And most importantly, of course, it is a question of the sheer removal, the physical geographic removal of the West from the rest of the country, the quite demographically populated parts of the country, by virtue of the sheer size of Canada. After all, in China, they say that the emperor is very far. So the emperor sits in Peking or Beijing, and if you're in Chongqing, the emperor is indeed very far. The emperor, no matter, regardless of intellect, does not know your reality. In the Canadian case, manifestly, the emperors in Ottawa do not know the reality of the West, even if they often hail from the West. The physical separation is just too big. And so our country has a problem, given its size, that the center, the decision-making centers, regardless of the sincerity or the intent, often does not know or understand or express sufficient sympathy for the reality of the extremities of the country. In the event, the West is the most discontented population in the country today. And I would add to that much of the northern population that is, by the way, psychologically quite connected to the West, particularly NWT, I might say. So, where do we find ourselves? The capital of Canada is Ottawa. This is dictated in the BNA Act of 1867, today called the Constitution Act of 1867, Section 16, says that the seat of government, unless the Queen says otherwise, is to be Ottawa. So of course, we know our capital to be a compromise decision between English and French Canada along the American border, and in my view, sufficiently cold, brilliantly cold, to deter American annexation. However, it is based on a four-colony model of Canada 1867. Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And Ottawa was the compromise within that four-colony scheme. What's to be done about the capital in the context of this condition, this proviso, constitutional proviso, and 10 provinces, 3 territories, in which Western provinces, Western populations are increasingly aggrieved or sense their distance? Answer, try to move part of the capital. And the only part of the capital that can be moved under this proviso is the judicial branch. Because in the Westminster understanding, government means the executive. À la limite, it also includes the legislature. So Parliament, obviously the Parliament buildings would stay in Ottawa. The executive, most of the ministries would stay in Ottawa. The Prime Minister and Cabinet would have a seat in Ottawa, and they would sit in Parliament in Ottawa. But the Constitution is silent on the location of the Supreme Court, and indeed on the location of the judicial branch, and Section 16 does not address it. So we have flexibility, and countries move their capitals or parts of their capitals all the time for strategic purposes, for economic purposes, for national unity purposes. And we have all those purposes on the table today. The only part of the government we can move is the judicial branch. I say move the judicial branch to Winnipeg, but we may choose any Western city of consequence, and we'll move the Supreme Court, we'll move perhaps the Federal Court of Appeal, and other branches of the judiciary, and no one will blink 10 years from now. They will be closer to the West. There'll be an economic fillip. There'll be a fillip in terms of the legal community, but it will also bring that branch of government closer physically to many of the populations that rightly feel they're great distance from Ottawa. It will give a huge favor to Ottawa as well, because it will finally have some of the feedback mechanisms, at least to one branch of government, that are missing terribly today in an otherwise intelligent capital. Last question, you might say, what happens to the Supreme Court building, the beautiful Supreme Court building in Ottawa? And I say, it stays beautiful. We'll just have another beautiful building. Winnipeg, Regina, Saskatoon, maybe even Yellowknife or Whitehorse. Let's make it happen.